public sector unit. There we had discussed that what is the current scenario of corporate governance in public sector units and why there are more problems related to implementation of corporate governance guidelines in public sector units as compared to private sector units. What is the position of corporate governance guidelines in private sector and public sector that we had discussed yesterday? What are the various issues because of which it is not implemented? That is, corporate governance guidelines are not implemented clearly or transparently in the public sector units. That also we had discussed yesterday. So today we will be discussing that what are the ways to improve corporate governance in public sector units. That we are going to discuss now. Now, first point or first way is professionalize the PSU boards. Now, professionalize the PSU boards. Yesterday also we had discussed that why the PSUs are not performing, why all the PSUs or most of the PSUs in India are becoming sick units. They have stopped earning profits and they are now into losses. What is the main reason? That we had discussed yesterday, that the highest authorities or the members included on the board, many of them are not selected on the basis of their merit, not selected on the basis of their qualification or experience in that particular field, but they are selected on the basis of how closely they are related to a particular person who is controlling that public sector unit. It can be the government officials, it can be the government ministers, or it can be any other person. Now, that is one of the main reasons why the PSUs are not performing. Now, if we want the PSUs to perform, the first and foremost thing is that professionalize PSU boards. Professionalize PSU boards. Very simple. That on the basis of their qualification, their experience in a particular field, the board members or the board directors should be appointed on the board of PSUs and not on the basis of their closeness. How closely they are related. That should not be the criteria of selecting a director at the company board. But the criteria should be that professional criteria. Professional criteria is very simple. That on the basis of his qualification, on the basis of his experience, the person is selected. That should be the criteria. Now, what is expected under professionalize the PSU boards? The public sector units boards should include candidates from the private sector as well. Most of the, or in many cases, all the board members are from the public sector companies. So what is expected is, okay, keep the members, keep the board members from the public sector units, but also include some professionals, some directors who were having expertise of working with private sector companies. So that is the first, that PSU board should include candidate from the private sector also. Next is PSU CMDs should be actively consulted for selecting and appointing independent and non-executive directors on PSU boards. Now the second point, very important. CMD, that means chairman and managing directors. Now chairman and managing directors or chief managing director, they should be consulted before finalizing the appointment of an independent director. Now, what is presently happening is a person who is controlling the ministry or that particular public sector unit without consulting the CMD, he is having the authority or he appoints that person forcibly. So, without following any norms. If such thing happens, we cannot expect good results from this person. So, as the managing director of public sector unit, he is controlling the organization. So he should be consulted before making the appointment of director at the board. So again, this one is very simple. Next one is greater authority should be given to the board members. That whatever decision they are taking or they want to take, they should have that much of authority, that much of powers with them, that if they feel that this particular decision can be in the interest of the PSU, they should have that authority that they would be able to take the decision. But presently, this is not happening, and that is why the results are not very good. Next one, ensure compliance with legal requirements and SEBI. Yesterday also we had discussed that when we compare the role of SEBI in private sector and in public sector unit, we find that SEBI is strict with the private sector unit, but it is not that strict with public sector unit. So that partiality should not be there. Rules are same. If the rules are same, many of the rules, many of the guidelines of corporate governance are same for public sector unit and from private sector unit, then implementation part should also be same. Regulatory part, monitoring part or controlling part of SEBI should also be same. It should not happen that some relaxations are given to the public sector unit, whereas those relaxations are not available for private sector units. And that's the reason private sector, because private sector companies knows that if they do not do the compliance, what type of punishment will be there, how much penalty they will have to pay, they are aware of that. And because of that, they are good in compliances. But same thing is not practiced by SEBI when we talk about public sector companies. That is the reason why compliances are not strictly followed in public sector companies. So no partiality should be there. Both the companies, both public sector units and private sector units shall be controlled, shall be monitored equally well by SEBI. And the main reason why SEBI is unable to control is that Along with SEBI, one more department is there which is taking care of public sector units, and that department also we had discussed yesterday, and that department is called as DPE, Department of Public Enterprises. Now, this DPE is also taking care of public sector units. Now, when two authorities are doing the same kind of monitoring or same kind of controlling, then there will be some sort of confusion. And that's the reason why SEBI is unable to be strict with public sector companies. Second reason we had discussed yesterday also, that as SEBI is a government controlled organization created by the government, same are the public sector units, which are government controlled organizations created by the government itself. So these are some of the ways where we can improve the functioning or performance of the public sector units. Last one related to how we can improve the performance of public sector units as compared to corporate governance guidelines. Lack of transparency. So there is lack of transparency in implementing the guidelines in public sector companies as compared to private sector companies. The reason we have discussed yesterday also, just now also we have discussed, as the board member, as the highest authority, are not appointed only on the basis of their merit, and that is one of the reason why the controlling is not strict. In private sector we have seen, suppose if 10 directors are there, their qualifications are fixed, their role and responsibility is fixed, everything is fixed, and on the basis of their qualification, of their experience only, they are recruited at the board. Rules are there, regulations are there, but they remain on paper if we talk about public sector unit. A recommendation letter from the minister may give a appointment to an director in the board of public sector unit. There, the qualification, the merits are ignored because of that recommendation letter. But such type of practice is not followed in the private sector companies. Because of this, there is lack of transparency also. So all these things, if they are taken care, then we can say that it will be the implementation of corporate governance guidelines in public sector units will also improve. So that was related to the public sector companies. Now, next one that we will be discussing is the banks. Implementation of the corporate governance guidelines in banks, how they are to be implemented, that we will be discussing. There are few changes when the implementation of corporate governance takes place to the bank. The rules and regulations are fixed, which banks are to be included, which banks are to be excluded, that is also clear. But as we have discussed that in public sector units, the implementation of the guidelines of corporate governance was not very good as compared to the private sector units. Same is the case here with banks also. In banks also, the implementation of corporate governance guidelines is there, but not as strict as the private organizations, private companies. So, for this reason, the Reserve Bank of India, in the month of April 2021, they have released certain guidelines where many of the things are clearly mentioned. What these guidelines are and why these guidelines are introduced by the Reserve Bank of India in April 2021, that we will be discussing. So at length, they have included everything, that which banks are applicable, these guidelines are applicable to which banks, and all the other details that they have included in the recommendations of RBI in the year 2021 in the month of April. Now I'll read some of the instructions and then we will discuss. The revised instruction would be applicable to all private sector banks, including small finance banks. So all the banks are included. And wholly owned subsidiaries of foreign banks in respect to State Bank of India and nationalized bank. These guidelines would apply to the extent of specific statutes applicable to these banks or instructions issued under these statutes. So all the banks are to be included under this. So for State Bank and for nationalized bank, all the guidelines are to be included, but it is to be checked whether these guidelines are in accordance with the rules and regulations of Reserve Bank of India related to the nationalized bank and particularly the State Bank of India. So that is the applicability part. Now, second is related to, or second guideline is related to chairman and the meetings of the board. Who will be the chairman? So the guidelines of corporate governance released by Reserve Bank of India says that the chairman of the board shall be an independent director. Independent director should be the chairman of the board. It is very much same with the chairman of board at a private sector unit, private companies. We have seen that. There also, the chairman of the board is an independent director. Here also, it is expected that an independent director should be the chairman of the board. Now, in the absence of the chairman of the board, the meetings of the board shall be chaired by an independent director. So they have mentioned very clearly, they have given more power to the independent directors. The guidelines of the Reserve Bank of India have given more power to the independent director. First power is that the chairman of the board of banks shall be an independent director. Now, if the independent director who is chairman of the board is absent during a meeting, then who will chair the meeting? Here again, not the managing director of that particular bank, general manager of that bank, but another independent director of the board will be chairing the meeting, will be the chairman for that particular meeting. They have mentioned the quorum also, that how many directors should be present for the meeting. So it is mentioned clearly that two-third member of the total strength shall be present for the meeting, and the meeting shall be attended by more than half of independent directors. So very clearly that when a meeting will be called as a valid meeting of the board at banks, so two-third directors should be present. And second important thing is, in this two-third, 50% directors should be independent directors. It should not happen that out of 10 directors, 7 are present, and out of 7, 4 should be independent director. If out of 7, 2 are independent directors and 5 are non-independent director or executive directors, then the meeting cannot be called as valid. So two-third should be the strength for calling a meeting a valid meeting. And the second important thing is that most of the members, or more than 50% of the members who are present for the board of directors meeting shall be independent directors. Now, next one, the important guideline is related to ACB. Here, ACB stands for Audit Committee of the Board. Now, audit committee, we have seen that audit committee is there in public sector companies, audit committee is there in private sector companies, as well as we have seen that in all the countries. We have seen the corporate guideline structure in South Africa, we have seen corporate guideline structure in UK, in Australia, and Singapore. In every country, one committee which is the most important committee, or which is the foremost committee, is the audit committee. So this committee is existing in banks also, and it should be constituted with only non-executive directors. Non-executive directors are those directors who are not involved in the day-to-day functioning of the bank. So these directors will be constituting and will be forming a committee. That committee will be called as audit committee. The chairman of the board shall not be member of the audit committee. Very clearly it has been mentioned that the independent director, who is the chairman of the board, cannot be part of the audit committee. How many meetings should be there of an audit committee? That also is mentioned in the guidelines, that every quarter the audit committee should meet. So that guidelines are very much same for the public sector companies and for the private sector companies. We have discussed that every quarter the meetings of audit committee shall take place. The quorum here also is two-third. The role and responsibility are very much similar to what we have discussed in the private sector companies, when we were discussing that the main reason, or the main role, is to check that there shall not be any financial irregularity in the financial statements prepared by the bank. That is the major role. Next committee is nomination and remuneration committee, that also we have discussed in public sector and private sector companies. The role of nomination and remuneration committee is very much similar. We have already discussed. This committee is supposed to do the nominations and finalize the remuneration of the board of directors and the highest authorities of the organization, that is the managing director or general manager of the bank, as well as they will be suggesting the names of to the board of the bank about the uh, directors to be included. Now here they have mentioned very clearly that what will be the tenure of the board members of nomination and remuneration committee. Here they have said that the upper age limit of the person who is included, who is appointed on the board of the bank shall be 75 years. After 75, no person can be included on the board of the bank. Now, for tenure, they have mentioned clearly that it is 8 years. It is 8 years, a continuous service of 8 years. Once a director is appointed on the bank, he can enjoy that position of director on the bank for 8 years in continuity. Now, if the person is to be re-elected on the board, renominated on the board, after 8 years, immediately he cannot be renominated. There has to be a gap of 3 years. So, Mr. A, if he has served at the board of a bank for 8 years, now Mr. A wants to be re-elected or renominated to the bank. In this case, immediate renomination is not possible. Mr. A has to wait for 3 years and then he becomes eligible till Mr. A achieves the age of 75 years. So that is mentioned very clearly. Now, what will be the remuneration? That is also mentioned. That the remuneration of the chairman of the board shall not exceed 20 lakhs per annum. The sitting fees are also fixed, that for, if suppose there are 5 meetings of the board, then for those 5 meetings, the chairman will be given the sitting fee allowance apart from this, his annual package. So annual package shall not be more than 20 lakh rupees. So these were some of the important guidelines of corporate governance related to the banks. So we have seen that all the banks, whether they are small banks or large banks, public sector, public bank, private bank, all the banks are included in the ambit of corporate governance. So corporate governance guidelines applied to all the banks, are applied to all the banks. Apart from, we have also seen that for nationalized bank and for State Bank of India, separate rules and regulations are also created. So these guidelines should be in accordance with those rules and regulations. So with this, we have come to an end of corporate governance. So we have discussed the corporate governance cases, corporate governance structure in other countries, corporate governance guidelines in private sector units, in public sector units, in banks, types of directors, types of companies, and the type of directors also. So the syllabus, we have completed the syllabus. In case if you need, say, revision, we can organize 1, 2, 3 more lectures also. But for that, you have to contact the coordinator of second year, Dr. Harshali or Dr. Vaishali Ajotikar madam. If you want, say, revision sessions of corporate governance, if you have not understood any concept, please just share me those concepts on my personal WhatsApp, that I have not understood this. So on a particular day, maybe this week, maybe next week, whenever we will be having time, we will let you know when we can organize the revision sessions. So we are very much open to revision sessions also. If you require, do let us know that you need revision session. So thank you everyone for being present for today's session. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.